You hear footsteps in the corridor of Whitehall, quiet and assured, like those of people who carry foreign secrets in the pocket of their coat. One evening in London in 1951, a door slams shut, and two men vanish forever, their path marked by invisible traces of treachery and silence. The spies of the Cambridge Five did not fire shots. They did not blow up bridges. Yet they shifted front lines with a single word that slid through secret channels to London, Washington, and Moscow. Their whisper was louder than cannons, because in that whisper lay plans for wars, diplomacy, and the atomic age. Who were these men, and why did the elite of Cambridge become the tunnel into the heart of the British intelligence services and foreign policy? The answer begins in the 1920s and 30s, in debating clubs, in the economic crisis, and in the shadow of fascism, which made communism appear to some as a moral counterweight. How was the seed planted? In the early 1930s, brilliant students in Cambridge argued about justice, red marks, and looked at photos of black shirts from Rome and brown shirts from Berlin. Soviet scouts like Arnold Deutsch and Theodore Malley were not looking here for loud agitators, but for quiet perfectionists with manners and connections, people who in 5 years would be sitting in the Foreign Office, at the BBC, in MI5, or in MI6. They wanted future insiders, not poster heroes, people with resumes that opened doors without a sound. Why did recruitment work exactly like that? Because British society ran on club rules. With the right school and the right recommendations, doors opened without awkward questions. The filter of class replaced real tests of loyalty, and faith in the honor of the gentleman made interrogations unnecessary and dangerous questions impolite. Those who belonged received advanced trust, and advanced trust in the world of secrets is a loan without collateral. What roles did they take on when the romantic university phase ended and the giant of the 20th century knocked at the door? Kim Philby joined MI6 in 1940, rose quickly, worked after the war as liaison to the CIA in Washington, and became a face of the British service. Donald Maclean entered the Foreign Office in 1935 and step-by-step gained access to sensitive telegrams, to drafts for the post-war order, and to the growing nuclear diplomacy. His desk was a vantage point on the international stage, and his notes were map material for the other pole. Who was the seemingly harmless hedonist guy Burgess, and why did no one push him out of the circle? Burgess began at the BBC, moved to the Foreign Office, and at times worked for MI6. He could charm, he could appear chaotic, and precisely this pose of irresponsibility served as a glaring flash behind which regular meetings with the Soviet residency were hidden. His notebooks were a jumble, yet in that jumble lay names, phone numbers, and small bridges to powerful people. He created social shortcuts, and shortcuts in the capital are faster than any courier post. Why was a soft-mannered art historian named Anthony Blunt needed in the war? Because Blunt was useful in MI5, amid countless files on extremists, saboteurs, and suspicious diplomats. He organized information, assessed threats, wrote analyses, and had access to things that foreign ears were not meant to hear, while his polite facade acted like an invisible key. Behind the velvet surface worked a precise machine that turned streams of files into judgments. Why does a fifth, quiet name appear in the story, almost always in the shadows? John Cairncross. Cairncross worked in the Treasury, later in the Ministry of Supply. During the war on technical committees, he read minutes, comparisons, exchanged lists with the USA. He did not run operations. He drew clean arrows and notes, and passed them on to where each arrow became a map of the future. His strength was invisible closeness to the levers of planning, not fame. How the war turned ideological students into cogs of a global influence machine, and what exactly they delivered. From 1940 on, the British services knotted a network of coalition intelligence, connecting London, Bletchley Park, Washington, and new institutions that carried the common cause. The leaks concerned plans for Allied coordination, political assessments, future occupation zones, recognition of governments in exile, and the architecture of a post-war Europe in which every word in a telegram was like a line on a map. Information turned into momentum, and momentum steers negotiations before they begin. Why this matters now? Because the mechanics of insider risk do not age. Ideologies change colors, yet the temptation to belong to a secret league that knows more than a cabinet remains. History is an early warning system if you read it as a system, not as an anecdote. That sharpens attention before mistakes become expensive. How the channel worked, who took, who gave, and why key moments coincided with administrative changes. Residencies in London and European capitals did not receive mountains of files from agents, but concentrates, core sentences, schedules of meetings. If a document was still being negotiated, its shadow already existed in Moscow, and that shadow made it possible to prepare responses, maneuvers, and diplomatic traps, always one step ahead. That was decisive. When did the first near catastrophes occur, and why were they not made public at once? In 1945, the Soviet officer Konstantin Volkov tried to defect in Istanbul and reported that there were high-level agents in London. The information landed on Philby's desk, and he in particular, responsible for the relevant section. One time for Moscow, Volkov disappeared, and a potential conflagration turned into a gray smoke. That changed the course. Why accusations faded after the war, even though the Cold War began and stakes grew? Because Britain and the USA were building new institutions. On the tables lay Berlin, the Alps, the Balkans, atomic cooperation, and doctrines that were to shape decades. In this overload, earlier signals did not become an overall picture, and the habit of believing one's own put the administration on autopilot. That shaped the situation. How Washington became the new stage for Philby, and why waves spread from there across two oceans. In 1949, Philby worked in Washington as liaison between MI6 and the CIA. He sat in meetings about covert operations and underground warfare, including plans in Eastern Europe. Here he saw what he could later destroy, the hope of toppling regimes with small landings and networks along Adriatic coasts and in alpine valleys. That made the difference, which operations suffered and what the word failure meant in human destinies. Between 1949 and 1951, British-American attempts to support anti-communist resistance in Albania and neighboring regions failed with striking regularity. Groups ran straight into ambushes after landing, radio networks were blown, people disappeared into prisons because someone had informed beforehand about routes, passwords, and time windows. That set the course. Why in 1951 a lamp labeled Homer lit up, and how ciphers spoke louder than diplomacy. The Venona project, underway since 1943, slowly cut into Soviet encryptions and brought to light the code name, whose pattern matched Maclean. MI5 tightened the ring, yet English formality slowed things, and Burgess, Maclean's friend and co-conspirator, got him out of the country. On May 25, 1951, both disappeared across the English Channel as far as Moscow. That weighed heavily. How London experienced it, and why the next act became a years-long staging with press, parliamentary questions, and public exonerations. Philby lost his post, yet in 1955 a minister declared there was no evidence. The country breathed out as if it had hung honor back in its frame. He went as a correspondent to the Middle East and continued the double life until 1963 chains of interrogations and confessions closed, and he disappeared by the same route, only later, gliding through Beirut's dusk to a Soviet ship. That did not remain without consequences. Why Blunt's confession did not strike immediately, and what reflective respectability did to the system. In 1964, Blunt made a confession under assurance of non-disclosure and escaped trial. Only in 1979 did the Prime Minister speak his name in Parliament. The art historian became a symbol of quiet disloyalty. It hit not only the service, but also the bourgeois belief that culture and education are a vaccine against foreign capitals. That shifted the frame. When and how Cairncross became visible, and why his path consisted of resignations, departures, and a late admission. Suspicion existed already in the early 1950s. Later, he went to Canada and Europe. In 1964, he admitted contacts with Moscow. He was not indicted, yet the shadow remained and showed that fifth numbers on lists are just as dangerous as first ones when they sit at nodes where information is created and distributed. That sharpened the gaze. What united all five beyond the university, and why that is more important than any ideological explanation. They shared the social key, access to rooms where a signature was worth more than a slogan, and a milieu that believed its own when he spoke calmly, confidently, and without overheating. Exactly this fabric of elite trust was the corridor that led them past controls, questionnaires, and moments of suspicion again and again. That was decisive. How their leaks bent the early course of the Cold War, and where you can see traces on the map. Secret plans for Eastern Europe broke predictably. Post-war talks about Germany and Austria felt as if an invisible participant with perfect knowledge sat at the table. In nuclear policy, the leaks did not concern construction plans, but the tempo of cooperation, cabinet decisions, and signals to Washington. They helped Moscow read where pause had been pressed and where covert readiness existed. That altered the course. Why one should separate myth and fact and not attribute to the quintet what other agents did. The mainstream of atomic secrets came from scientists in American laboratories. British channels delivered context, intentions, and deadlines. Not the powder, but the fuse. Precisely for that reason, their contribution was strategic. Better to know which door the opponent will open tomorrow than to steal the key that was changed yesterday. That made the difference. How the USA reacted and what that meant for an alliance in which trust was scarce anyway. Americans tightened controls. The exchange of cryptographic technology and access rules underwent a cool modernization. Every Y received approve it. And the CIA and FBI factions argued over whether one could rely on British assessments when people there were writing yesterday with 2 addresses of loyalty. That shaped the situation. Why the story is not only past, but the architecture of today's shadows and data. The patterns remained. Long careers built on impeccable biographies, patronage by great names, an ideological nerve that glorifies stepping over the line as a higher purpose. Today, a mass of data is added, which you do not carry in a briefcase, but on a tiny medium, and admin access equals a suitcase full of papers from earlier times. That set the direction. What happened in MI5 and MI6 when suspicion became the air that whole floors breathed? They checked calendars, compared routes, drew contact matrices, yet each matrix struck an invisible wall, the habit of taking account of titles and recommendations. It took years and external jolts until the hard logic of leaks rolled over the soft logic of class, and the ironic smile of a King's College graduate lost its pass. That weighed heavily. What images cling to the 5 and why they help to understand the mechanics of their success. Philby stands for discipline and a cool cut, Maclean for the diplomacy analyst with an international nerve, Burgess for the play with the pose of chaos, Blunt for quiet method in the sanctuary of counterintelligence, Cairncross for the shadow over technical meetings. Each type covered the weaknesses of the others. Together they work like sound engineers who erase interference where the audience believes it hears pure music. That did not remain without consequences. Why defeats did not end the subject and how memory lives on in textbooks and service regulations. Because it is not about names, but about method, and method outlasts its carriers. Loud cases became teaching pieces, by which hiring procedures, test scenarios, and access monitoring were rewritten. Every machine received protocols that speak to each other. That shifted the frame. What ethics means in such a game and how it collides with the myth of chivalrous intelligence work. Ethics demands the separation of personal conviction and public mandate. British tradition trusted too much in personal honor as a security system. If honor becomes a mask for the double life, institutions set records in gullibility, and the opponent receives a free service one could not order for money. That sharpened the gaze. Why public dramas around confessions and escapes are necessary, even though most of it happens in silence. Because a society needs mirrors in which not only the faces of heroes, but also its own blind spots become visible. Scandals force the checking of manuals, the asking of who may read what when millions of lives are affected. That was decisive. What Philby's last stage from Beirut to Moscow showed, and what feelings it left with believers in his innocence. It showed that even after official exonerations and warm recommendations, a person can choose a ship of another power as the last home port. For some it was a shock, for others the confirmation of dark suspicions, for the system the lesson that patents of honor hold only until the first proven route to the quay. That altered the course. How Blunt spent the years after his exposure, and why museum halls preserved the shadow of counterintelligence. He continued scholarly work, wrote about French art, and remained in academic programs until a parliamentary word turned the fine historian into a sign of an era. Since then, every sentence about high taste and low loyalty has sounded different, as if the frame around a painting recalled the safe in the cellar. That made the difference. Why it is worth looking back into the Cambridge clubs, and what is wrong with the romance. There arose the conviction that the world divides into injustice and antidote, and that the antidote demands personal daring. This logic quickly turns the secret passing of documents into moral heroism within one's own coordinate system, and afterward there is always a justification for everything further. That shaped the situation. What happened to the trust between London and Washington after 1951, and how that shaped the structure of alliances. Trust was rationed, access questions decided according to the principle of the least necessary knowledge. Joint operations required additional verifications. That slows alliances, but makes them more resilient against internal leaks. And it is precisely for that reason that they survived crises one would not forgive in ordinary friendships. That weighed heavily. What the security officer in the ministry, the database administrator in the research center, and the news editor learned today. They learn not to look at the shine of the resume, but at routes of loyalty, at circles, at strange rhythms of travel and publication. They learn to notice the habit of leaving a room 5 minutes before the end to call from a phone booth, and the habit of being there already before the agenda begins. That did not remain without consequences. Why they continue to have an effect even unmasked in security culture and pop culture, where espionage always remains a bit of a novel. Because stories of double lives offer a simple formula. This formula sneaks into series, novels, and jokes, and blurs the border between archival pain and evening entertainment. What once more recalls Volkov and what his disappearance says about the inevitability of truth. It says that truth misses trains when the conductor received the timetable in advance. It says that a quick intervention smothers the alarm in bureaucracies when the alarm lands on the desk of a man who needs silence. That set the direction. How controls changed after each loud case, and why progress was uneven. In some years, origin was scrutinized more strictly. In others, technical discipline, rotations were introduced, roles separated, overlaps of access reduced. But the system resisted because every protective measure offends when addressed to those accustomed to working on trust, and precisely this resistance delayed reforms. That weighed heavily. What ideology meant for each of them, and whether they were simple careerists. Ideology was both justification and Ariadne's thread. It allowed deception to be classified as service and a secret channel as a contribution to global justice. Careerists are more likely to sell for money. Here they sold for meaning, and precisely for that reason, they were selected so carefully. The motive of meaning lasts longer than the motive of advantage. That did not remain without consequences. What price this meaning had for those on the other side of the radio traffic and the trap at the border. It was paid in smashed undergrounds, in years behind bars, in broken families, and in quiet, almost invisible shifts between capitals. While biographies stand on the shelf, many of the betrayed are long since under the ground or live with a silence in which one does not tell children where the father was. That sharpened the gaze. Why the outcome of the five is not a full stop, but an ellipsis that passes into security courses and codes of conduct. Because every time a new employee receives a clearance, these names appear not as legends, but as control questions. The right answers are not data and session numbers, but the habit of doubting when a too-perfect biography opens too easily doors to heavy rooms. That was decisive. What the viewer feels on hearing this, and why it is useful not to stop at anger. It is useful to turn feeling into observation, to recognize patterns of hidden efficiency and patterns of strange inattentiveness. It is useful to remember that great leaks begin with small, unasked questions, and that their absence is the best friend of a foreign agent. That altered the course. Where the world leads if we make elite infallibility and club recommendations the norm again, instead of transparent procedures. It leads to a repetition of the same play, only with digital scenery and quicker scene changes. Then people appear again whose perfect accent and impeccable suit become the key to safes in which decisions about millions of fates lie. That made the difference. Why back to May 1951, into the car by the Thames, into maps and ferries heading east? Because in such points history becomes physical. You hear a door slam, the click of a key, the whir of wet tires. And those who listen well notice that this sound has not passed. It repeats as soon as systems forget to ask the right questions in time. That shaped the situation. Is the system protected today? Have the lessons been fully internalized? No, because protection is not a state. It is a process, and processes decay if you do not feed them with attention. The stories of the Cambridge Five are not a monument. They are a metronome that beats the tempo of doubt so that no one falls asleep on watch, even if carpets muffle footsteps. That weighed heavily. How to end so that more remains than a chronicle, a sentence that does not evaporate with the last image. With this, that elite is no vaccine against temptation, and good upbringing does not replace good procedures. As long as in important houses there are rooms that one enters with a nod instead of with a pass, as long as ideals justify paths withdrawn from daylight, as long as voices count without verification, a whisper penetrates these rooms. This whisper wants again to be louder than cannons, for a whisper dreams of commanding the thunder. If we know that, we are ready to ask the uncomfortable questions in time. And if we are ready, why should we let the whisper set the beat once more?